Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net, joined by Rabbi Joshua Neely, our friend from Florida, and we're looking today at just a chat really, but about Pesach. We've been had some interesting things pop up on Facebook, so I thought I'd put them to the rabbi and we can share some information and see where the conversation leads us. Thank you for joining me again today.
Uh, Always my pleasure.
So I want to jump straight in. First, I want to remind people, and there'll be a little thing pop up on your screen now that we covered. We had a conversation before about grain and about the differences in tradition and about chametz. Oh, so this is one of the things that came up. So I thought it was chametz, but I saw a website, and to be fair, it's a pretty good website, jewfacts.org, for the knowing the background of the person that put the site together. I'm pretty amazed that it is as well put together as it is. But they say it's kind of a soft C, and it's like chametz, like an H, and it ends in like a soft S instead of a Z.
So I don't know the site. I don't know what that's. I know Jewfact, but I don't know what that site says about it. But maybe what you're bumping up against is different pronunciation traditions. I mean, if you are in communities that come from many parts of Europe, when you're speaking in Yiddish or now in English or other vernaculars, the accent will often switch. So rather than saying chametz, you'll say chametz. As the way to accent that word. But modern Israeli pronunciation tries to capture the accent on the last syllable typically. There are some exceptions within Hebrew grammar. And that's what many American synagogues also try to do. Ever since 1948, there's been a long push to sort of standardize our pronunciation to the modern Israeli traditions.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So that there's kind of a shared Israeli understanding of language that people are trying to adopt.
Well, it isn't just that it's an Israeli understanding. I mean, well, there's a mixture that's going on there. So this is a great tangent to start with, because what happened is that the Hebrew became through Yiddish in Europe became a vernacular again. It became a sort of common language mixed with German and other bits here and there, which gave people a familiarity with certain words that were then shoehorned into a European style of speaking. And that became a very dominant pronunciation tradition within Europe. The Sephardim and the Mizrahi, the Jews that were from North Africa, from the Middle East, and other communities, they didn't have that same experience. Ladino, which was the pidgin language of Hebrew and Spanish, was much more heavily just Spanish, and so the Hebrew didn't become as manipulated. It wasn't just changed as it was in Europe. What happened when Israel was founded is many of the founders who came from Europe were specifically looking to reject the Europeanism of Judaism because they were upset with many of their communities, which was why they were forging ahead to leave Europe and set up Israel so that it could be a reclamation of their culture. That's why Yiddish was rejected as a national language in Israel, even though so many of the early immigrants spoke Yiddish. And so when they were setting up Hebrew as being the natural language for Israel, they chose to adhere to the Sephardic Mizrahi traditions, which, and especially in terms of accent, of which syllable gets accented, do much more closely follow the traditions of the Tanakh, of the Bible.
That's super interesting. So it could be chametz, it could be chamatz, it could be chametz.
Exactly. You know, you'll hear different holidays pronounced. My favorite for hitting the maximum differences between the old Ashkenazic pronunciation and the modern Hebrew pronunciation is Shavuot or Shavuos.
Shavuos, that's right. I've heard that before. Shavuos.
So there's both the same holiday, and either one is, I mean, you can argue which one is objectively more correct or less correct, but they both have very interesting historical reasons for it. And just like every other language, you're going to find that in Hebrew, there is no way for us to know exactly how it sounded. coming out of the mouth of someone like Moses.
Mm.
Just the same way that we do not know exactly how English sounded coming out of the mouth of Shakespeare, and that was a lot more recent. But language pronunciation traditions are very hard to be absolutely sure of what they were.
Actually, the Shakespeare reference is a good one. You often see things on TV, and there'll be a skit or a sketch, English or American, and they'll be trying to speak in a kind of Middle Ages way, 14 to 1600, and they sound very much like upper class English people. When the chances are, with the pidgin English that was spoke then, it would be nearly indiscernible for us to hear that. So how much more so something that was 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But no, it's a good point. Okay, that went off in a weird way. What I wanted to go to first, because we're going to talk about Pesach today, is the statement I heard is, if you don't eat lamb on Pesach, you're not fulfilling the commandment. But today, the Jews do not eat lamb on Pesach. Would that be correct? Well, actually, I know that's not correct. Most Jews.
You've learned the wonderful word most.
Yeah, that's
exactly,
right.
exactly right. So the short answer is that there was a long-standing debate right after the destruction of the Second Temple of whether or not the Pesach offering, the Korban Pesach, would be continued to be offered, because there are, I don't want to go down the whole, but there are some reasons to think that maybe that particular sacrifice could be offered even if the temple itself weren't standing. The history of when and where sacrifices could be offered is fascinating and really, really complicated, and best done with lots of slides and source texts and such like that.
Can I just jump in there and say one of the things that often people don't think about is the fact that although the temple was destroyed, that wasn't the first time the temple was destroyed, and there was a large period of time between the first and second temple when Jews were still Jews and did Jew things. And
Right.
I think that's part of the argument, right? That they kept Pesach in a Jewish traditional way for the period in that middle gap. So that argument that happened after may have been because, well, if we could do it before, why can't we do it now?
It's partly that, and it's partly also the emotional connection that even if the Jews at the time after the destruction by the Romans agreed that you couldn't, they probably, or shouldn't, they probably emotionally were so attached to it that they had difficulty letting go. And so whether or not they considered the lamb that they were eating to actually be the Korban Pesach or not, they still offered it, or not offered, they still slaughtered a lamb and had it, because that's what you do for Pesach. But because of that confusion, the tradition quickly became, in most communities, not to have lamb on that night. Like I said, there was a period of transition where some people tried to keep the memorial, the zecher of the Passover sacrifice going by eating lamb. But over time, people realized that it was very misleading and really confusing to the average person to be able to tell the difference between this lamb that we slaughtered because we were hungry and that lamb we used to slaughter, which was an actual sacrifice. So yes, right now the vast majority of communities do not have lamb on the Passover night in order to avoid that confusion.
But then we end up with a difficult question, because we have an instance in Torah when there's a commandment to eat lamb.
There's a commandment to eat of the Passover sacrifice.
Right.
If it's not the Passover sacrifice, there's no commandment to have meat that comes from a lamb.
Okay. So bouncing off that, how do we have a situation where a family is celebrating Pesach without the parts of the text being included? Because you could argue that Pesach, with the Seder plate and the parts that make up the Seder plate, aren't completely in the text, and neither is the text completely fulfilled on the plate. So is it that the Jews today aren't fulfilling the biblical Pesach, or is it that they're remembering something that they will do at a later point in history?
So I think the underlying issue that needs to be uncovered here is actually one that also applies, for example, to Yom Kippur, where we no longer have the sacrifices that we used to have at Yom Kippur. To see that the events of the holidays were clusters of activities. There wasn't a single commandment that was fulfilled by checking off the box of every single underlying point, but instead there were many different commandments, each of which had the opportunity to be fulfilled by doing its particular action. But if one was unable to do one of them, that didn't mean that one was doing none of them. That didn't mean that the entire experience was wrong or invalid. So let me give you another example that you probably also have encountered. The wearing of the blue thread on the corner of the talit. Many people say, well, if you don't have techelet, you're not wearing a talit. No, if you read the commandment very carefully there, it says you will attach the fringes to the corners of your garments and you will have a string of blue. If you cannot have a string of blue, which was absolutely the case for a very long time, and we can maybe have another conversation about what the case is today, but if you can't have a string of blue, that doesn't mean you can't have the fringes. And it doesn't mean that your talit is not a talit. It just means that you are unable to do the extra mitzvah that is happening at that time. And so too for Passover. The commandments of Passover are more than eating the lamb, eating the actual Passover sacrifice. The commandments of Passover are also to teach. The commandments are also to rejoice. And the commandment is also to eat the bitter herbs, although that comes down to a question of whether the eating of the bitter herbs, the maror, is a commandment in and of itself or a commandment that is also contingent upon eating the Passover sacrifice. That's a debate still among authorities, but everybody agrees that we should go ahead and still eat it. And then, of course, the commandment also to eat matzah. So given that eating the Passover sacrifice is only one commandment out of all of these, the fact that we are unable to have the sacrifice doesn't mean that we are unable to do the commandments. It just means we're unable to do that particular commandment at this time.
And so thinking about the content of the Seder plates, the bone represents the meat that you're not eating, but it reminds you of the meat that you would eat or will eat when you can fulfill the commandment to take the lamb that you've hand-selected and reared in your home and loved to the temple to be slaughtered by the priest and then roasted, and then you take that portion home and you eat that during the feast, and the bone represents that.
Exactly, and it's not just a reminder of what we our aspiration as well as what our history was. It's also a declaration that I'm not eating the Passover sacrifice because I've either forgotten about it or I'm rejecting it. I'm not eating it because I don't have that option. Here is my symbol that if I had the option, I would do it.
Yeah, I have the meat. I got the bone from the meat. Had I been able to take the meat in the correct way and cook it in the correct way, I would have done. So basically, I think what you're saying is that the Torah in itself is a list of instructions which aren't a all or nothing scenario. It's about doing the best and the most you can, rather than just avoiding it altogether if you can't manage anything.
Absolutely. I mean, if somebody is able to keep kosher, as another example, that they're not eating any animals that are forbidden, but for whatever reason they have not been able to find kosher meat from a kosher animal locally, so they are eating beef. Not recommended. That it's better to be a vegetarian if you can't source kosher beef locally. But if someone were to eat it, you wouldn't say, well, they're completely failing. They're still making the right choice to avoid pork or shrimp or things like that. They're just got another commandment that they're working on.
Can I ask a little bit about the contents of the Seder plate? And specifically, there are things like haroset and an egg, which would be foreign to the text of what the text is driving you to eat at the feast. How did those things come about?
So really, the underlying question that we have to get to before we get to that is why are we doing a Passover feast with narration? Right, because that's going to answer that whole underlying cluster of questions.
Haggadah is
exactly.
the narration
That's one of those good words, of different pronunciation traditions. It's either the Haggadah or Haggadah. But and both are fine. And also, if you're speaking in English, it's perfectly normal to use the English version, the Hebrewish.
Hebrewish, that's very good. Someone should make a CD. Rosetta Stone, that's a new one. So for people that are new, this is a kind of a timetable, right? It's a how-to, a rota of things that you help you get through or help you organize and walk you through. It's like how would you... It's like a Wikipedia page or a how-to page on how to have your Pesach. And there are lots of different types, right, of the Haggadah. There are short ones and long ones, and there are themed ones. And
right. I mean, the earliest version that we get is a discussion in the Mishnah that's then elaborated on in the Talmud. So the idea is that this is actually fulfilling really the commandment that is found in the story of the Exodus, that we will remember that day and we will recount what God did for us. And that is what we are trying to do during the Passover Seder. And the Haggadah is making sure that we do that fully. So, yes, somebody might say, well, okay, so I sit down, I get my dinner out, and I say, thank you, God, for taking us out of Egypt. Let's eat. And theoretically, you might be still fulfilling that essence of explaining why we are celebrating Passover. However, the sages, I think, made a very, very good point, which is, are you really giving it the proper respect and devotion and explanation that the Seder, that Passover deserves? Have you really done your due diligence, as we would say in business circles, by simply saying, God took us out of Egypt, well, let's eat?
Because there's also a strong emphasis on teaching the children, right? So you have to ask yourself, if we sat down with the children and it's their first time, and you said, "Thank you, God, for taking us out of Egypt in the Exodus," and then asked the children what happened, they wouldn't know.
They would be clueless, absolutely. But the children, it's great that you mentioned that, because one of the clearest points we have in the Torah about these additional mitzvot that are found, that also causes people a lot of consternation, is the four sons or the four children section of the Seder, which talks about there are four different types of children. And it will say, there are four types of children like the Torah talks about. And you go, what? What are you talking about? Well, if you actually read the Torah carefully, you'll see that there's four different verses throughout the Torah that specifically say that your children are going to ask you about this, and you're going to explain it to them in the following types of ways. And then there's one additional one, and I should point out there's three that are like that, and then there's one in Deuteronomy where you initiate the conversation with your kid. And of course, those three then map to the four children. And then we learn the wonderful pedagogical technique that just because they're each asking a question doesn't mean I give them the same answer. I have to give them answers that reflect and speak to their particular state at that particular moment. Which is just one of the most wonderful insights to find at the beginning of what is essentially a very long lesson plan. That just because you have the lesson plan doesn't mean that different people, and then it follows up immediately with the discussion of old people, that different people are going to need to hear different things in order to get the message for that particular night.
Lesson plan is a much better way of saying it. The four children have a name attached to each one, don't they?
Yes.
I think
wise, wicked, simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. Simple, and then the phrase there, Tom, is like innocent. or naive might be a better word, or just beginning to learn. They're old enough and capable of recognizing something special is going on, but they don't really have an opinion yet about it.
Mm.
In some ways, you might just call them a blank slate, but it's one that's opened because it's asking he or she is asking the question, and that means you recognize a certain preparedness for learning, unlike the one who doesn't know how to ask, which is you're going to be taking them by the hand to lead them through this experience, so they know that questions are what they're supposed to be doing, that they are supposed to think this is odd in order to trigger all of those reactions and then questions. And that's, by the way, why we also have the custom of having the 4 questions be given to the youngest child. It's meant to teach them not to recite a particular passage of Hebrew, but it's meant to teach them to notice what we're doing, how it is different, so that they'll ask why it's different, and then we'll be able to give them the story of the Exodus.
Mm. I had to talk about that because there will be people who hear the words like wicked and simple, and they'll instantly they'll feel confused, and so we have to go down that road just for a second. So there would have been a period, is it fair to say, where this kind of text wouldn't have existed, or is this kind of an amalgamation or a base setting? I mean, we've talked a little bit before about how the Torah started. We did a whole series on the Torah. I think we did one on the Haggadah as well. We did one on Midrash. But there was definitely going to be a point in history where someone sat down and they said, well, these are the things which should be listed in this document.
Look at it this way. If I were to say to you, at least I'm assuming that this phrase works in the UK as well and Ireland. If I were to say to you, I think it's time to have the talk, the birds and bees talk with your kids, you would instantly know what I was referring to.
Yeah.
And you might tell it a little differently than I tell it. But I would be reasonably confident that we would cover most of the same material. You might emphasize one thing more, I might emphasize something else, you might leave off a particular topic, until the kid is older. But the basics of the birds and the bees is a published oral tradition. And indeed, that's what the Haggadah was for a very, very long time. It was a published oral understanding of what we would expect to be covered while we were doing this. What the sages did in the Mishnah was to come along and say, all right, for those of you who aren't 100% sure what we mean when we say retell the story of Pesach, here are some ways to do it. Here are your key points that you're going to want to mention. You're going to want to get people asking questions. You're going to want to talk about the going down into Egypt, the oppression in Egypt, and God leading us out of Egypt. You're going to want to sing songs of praise. You're going to want to have some, thank you passages. And those are what were originally written. And indeed, in the original versions that we see recorded in the Mishnah and also in the Talmud, there are some variations from ours. Their culture of dipping was different than our culture of dipping. They actually had a Passover sacrifice, and so they asked questions about it that we no longer ask because the Passover sacrifice isn't on our plate. So it is a lesson plan that has evolved over the last couple thousand years. But basically, it was a capturing of what that published oral tradition of telling the story of the birds and bees, telling the story of how we left Egypt, that was already shared by the community at the time.
So that leads me on back to the contents of the Seder plate. Seder, for anyone listening, means kind of order. And it's a regular word in modern Hebrew, right? People...
Exactly. I mean, it means order. It's as simple as using, the word order in English.
And it's a large plate that generally has 6 sections on it, and they can be quite elaborate or quite simple. And I know at the museum I volunteer at, we've got a huge one. It's like 18 inches. It's massive, and it's got all of the tribes of Israel around the outside edge, and then inside that ring there are the 10 plagues, and it's all beautifully ornate. But basically, at the end of the day, it's supposed to hold 6 items, or 6 containers which each have an item in them.
Although I do have to point out 5 or 6.
Oh, okay. Is this because of is it the egg that's different? Because I have to say, I'm kind of confused about the egg.
No, it's because actually of the chazeret, the extra piece of lettuce.
Oh, okay.
Which was also considered to be an extra bitter herb.
Right. So talk us through the contents on the plate there.
All right. So we'll start with the one that we've already mentioned, the zaroa, the shank bone. So there's a bone that is a reminder of the Passover sacrifice, and that is mentioned explicitly later on in the Haggadah itself, so that we will reference why we are remembering the Passover sacrifice very explicitly. And it really, as you said, when we did our Haggadah video, that should make it a little bit more detail of what's going on there. Then there's also going to be maror, the bitter herbs. As was mentioned already, in the Torah it says that we eat the Passover sacrifice and we eat maror. So maror is a bitter herb. Some confusion about whether or not that's meant to be horseradish or not. I will say the vast majority of officials say that if you can get a better bitter herb that's an actual herb than horseradish, that's what you should get. Horseradish was a make-do in parts of Europe where we couldn't get better herbs at this time of year.
Is there a possibility that you can get it in the Middle East? I suppose that would be the difficult.
Oh, you can get it many places now. I mean, we have a wonderful global food culture.
But I meant like back in the day, if that's what they were talking about in the text.
Oh yes, absolutely. Back in the day, nobody ate horseradish. Back in the day, everybody ate bitter, leafy plants.
Okay.
Think your endives, your rocket, your arugula, your romaine lettuce, the way it was before we bred all of the bitterness out of it. That was the standard bitter herb.
So this is less about a specific thing and more about describing something that you've got a little bit of free choice on?
Yeah, there's a range of options that are available. The options are all bitter in order to match the commandment of Torah that we eat a bitter herb. It's
terrible because I don't actually mind horseradish that much.
Well, neither do I. No, I'll have horseradish as a garnish or condiment, when I'm eating it other times. And it's not just a question of minding, it's also a question of very distinct taste. Horseradish is not bitter, which is why it is really a very poor second choice for your bitter herbs. Horseradish may be considered spicy, depending upon how strongly it's prepared. But that only makes you weep. It doesn't actually leave bitterness in your mouth. And it's the bitterness that is the emotion we're trying to remember. Because all of us can remember what it's like to be in pain. You've stubbed your toe, you've had a toothache. You know what pain feels like. But do you know what the bitterness of slavery feels like? Which is a much more corrosive emotion than bitterness, or a much more corrosive emotion than pain.
Very good. Okay.
And on the plate, we also have haroset. Haroset is a apple mixture blend that usually has wine, and then the recipes go wild from there. Some of them also have types of nuts or almonds, or some things will have cinnamon mixed into them. It's a wonderful tasting dish. My family loves eating it for the entire week of Pesach, not only on the Seder. And this is serving two jobs. The primary job is this is what we dip our bitter herb in order that the bitterness not be overpowering, that we not completely saturate ourselves in bitterness, because the overall emotion of Pesach is meant to be joy. So there's already a little bit of a scaling back, even from only eating a bitter herb to having bitter herb plus this dip. And this is, of course, the second dipping that takes place that gets referred to in the 4 questions.
Everyone has their own, the amount of people that have said, I'll send you my haroset recipe. It's the best one you'll ever have. You won't taste anything like this. Everyone's got their own favorite one. And if you've got one, if you're listening and you think you have the winner, then post it in the comments underneath and we'll go through them and share them.
And then, of course, there's additional symbolism that has been also referred to around the haroset. I mean, the apples are considered to be a reminder of the Midrash where the women went out to the orchards in order to be with their husbands and in order that they could keep their intimacy secret from Pharaoh, as well as trying to make sure that our people continue to propagate. And fruit is always a metaphor for romance, as well as in particular the love between God and Israel, which you see a lot of in Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs.
Mm. And am I right in saying that it's also representative of the cement?
Making the mud bricks.
Yeah,
yes.
sure, yeah.
It also depends on who's making it. I go for a very muddy haroset personally. It's a very thick spread in our recipe. Some people do more of a diced apple kind of haroset. Not my personal preferred version, but yes, when you get it nice and muddy looking, then it really does capture the whole feel of the mud bricks that our ancestors were forced to make.
Okay, and we'll go on to the second piece of lettuce. I'm intrigued.
So the second piece of lettuce, the chazeret, is well, there's a couple different options, right? So some people think that this was a bonus to make up for. Not sure if your first piece was exactly the right one, especially if you were forced to use horseradish. But a lot of people also use this piece in order to make the Hillel sandwich, which is the matzah, the bitter herbs, and charoset that is eaten right before the main meal. And so this would be an extra piece for that. But like I said, there are many customs whose Seder plate do not include a additional piece at all.
And the egg, is this like a raw egg? Is it boiled? Is it baked?
So it's usually hard boiled and or roasted.
Okay.
And officially, it is a reminder of the Haggadah sacrifice, which was an additional sacrifice offered on every holiday. But the egg is also usually seen as a symbol of hope, of new life, of the cycle of life. And so it has that symbolism as well.
And do we know when the egg was introduced? I mean, it's just, in the back of my head, I'm kind of going, it's spring, eggs are everywhere.
Like I said, the idea that this was a reminder of the Haggadah sacrifice, which is when you went to celebrate with God. You would eat in the city of Jerusalem in order to celebrate at the same time with everyone else for the holidays, the pilgrimage festivals. But as far as the egg showing up as a requirement rather than an example of something that would have been a cooked dish that was offered, or not offered, but eaten in that celebratory meal at the time. I remember there was, I think the first mention of it is sometime in the late Middle Ages. I'm thinking, and I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it was something in the Shulchan Aruch in the Ramah, the Ashkenazic version. That is to say, the Ashkenazic additions to the Shulchan Aruch to account for Ashkenazic variations. But I'm pretty sure that was the first time it gets mentioned as being have this. But really, that's a great way to underscore what's going on here, which is we have the obligation to teach. We have the obligation to retell and study for ourselves and make sure that we truly understand so that we appreciate what God did for us. And we use different methodologies to achieve that. And so we use 4 different cups to represent the 4 different promises of redemption. We talk about 4 different ways of learning because the Torah talks about teaching 4 times. We point out and recount the different symbols in order to remind ourselves of what they symbolize. We change around the meal so it looks different so that people are forced to ask, why are we changing it? We do song versions of the redemption. We do story versions of the redemption. There's so many things that are done to make sure that no matter how you do your Seder, something is going to help trigger your deeper understanding and appreciation. If somewhere at some point someone said, what's missing from this? We're not really emphasizing the Haggadah thing enough. We're not emphasizing the life that we feel. What does that? An egg would do that. Let's show an egg. Then very easily that can move into the ceremony. It's not a mitzvah in the sense that if you skip the egg, you haven't violated the Torah. No one would say that. But you might have missed an opportunity that has been seen as a very useful one for many, many, many generations to make a point.
So you talked about the Haggadah being a lesson plan. You could call the things on the plate teaching aids.
Absolutely. It is a very multimedia lesson plan. A sight, scent, sound, or sounds, tastes, feels, it's all there.
One last thing, we did talk about it before one time, but it was so good that I just want to make sure we fit it into this one too. And that's Elijah and his cup and the purpose for that cup. Because when you told me before, it literally blew my mind because it was totally not what I'd heard. So can you tell us a little bit about why there is a place set for Elijah and what the cup is for?
Well, there isn't a place set for him per se. It's not like we have an empty chair at the table. Although if he shows up at my Seder, I'd be more than happy to give him my chair. So that doesn't mean he's not welcome. But the Elijah's cup is called that not because the cup per se is for Elijah to drink, but because we are unsure. There's a rabbinic debate that we're sure that we're supposed to do 4 cups because there are these 4 promises of redemption, but we're not sure if we are supposed to also recount at the Seder the 5th cup, the 5th promise of redemption, because in the 5th promise and the very next verse, God says that he will take us to Israel. And so the question is, are we only celebrating God's deliverance of us from Egypt, and therefore the 4 promises are good? And by the way, this is in Exodus 6. Or do we celebrate all the good that God has done for us, at which point we should also raise the 5th cup and say a blessing and drink it? And so that 5th cup is left as I'm not sure. So what we do is we go ahead and we pour that 5th cup, and then we say, I guess I should say, there's a broader rabbinic tradition that one of the things that will happen when Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, comes in order to foretell the coming of Mashiach, of the Messiah, is he will also help us answer the questions that we have been unable to answer about Jewish practice. And so when he shows up and says the Mashiach is coming, we'll say, that's great. By the way, this cup, 5th promise, for Pesach or not for Pesach? And then if he says it's for Pesach, we'll say Borei Pri Hagafen, and we will drink it. And if he says not for Pesach, then we just leave it on the table.
Excellent. Thank you, because honestly, it was so muddy. Some of the things I've heard about that so muddy, and anyone new to this, that they're going to find that very interesting. I know I do. I don't know. Is there anything else you want to throw in before we sign off?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, it's really interesting to know what questions other people have, and I really appreciate hearing from people who are coming at it from a very different point of view or perspective. Because it gives me a chance to think about things differently. Well, I mean, as you know, I love teaching, and it's just very fascinating to hear some of the misinformation that's out there, but also some of the partial correct information, or sometimes where there's just a big blank spot, and it's nice to be able to help fill that in.
Right, so you guys at home, if you're listening and you've got questions about Judaism, about Torah, the Tanakh, about practices, or you don't understand something that you've seen, or you're confused about something that doesn't make sense, or you think that there's a kind of a weird Jewish practice and you don't understand why that's the case, we want to know, so we can throw all those questions into some programs and cover some weird stuff. So if you've got a question which you think is totally odd, or that no one else would answer it, we will. And don't think it's stupid. I've asked some really dumb questions, and you really won't get an answer unless you ask. So please leave them in the comments section. And if you're too embarrassed, then you can PM me on Facebook. That's
right. And I'll just give you the very short, reminder that if something looks weird, I can guarantee either that there is a very reasonable and logical answer, or there was a very reasonable and logical answer that a lot of people no longer know, but we can find it together, or that isn't what you thought you saw, or it is what you thought you saw, and the people doing it are not within the mainstream of practice.
Yeah, it could actually be a little bit weird. But the chances are pretty slim.
That are weird, but the people that are that weird are not usually in that mainstream.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, Rabbi, for giving us your time today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for bringing it all together.
You guys at home, Rabbi Neely has his own channel on YouTube. There'll be a link under the headline on this YouTube page, and there'll also be a window that's popping up around now. You can click that and see his weekly messages and lessons. They're well worth watching. And leave your comments below. Don't forget you can see my other videos on this channel. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. And if you have subscribed already, don't press the button again. It will just make everything go away, and you won't see any of our new programs. I feel terrible for saying it, but I every time I put up a new video, it's like 12 people unsubscribe, and then I see them kind of come back the day after when they realized it only works one time. But yeah, thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you all again very soon.